Welcome to Turbulence, a special series on global finance and geoeconomics in an age of disruption. From All Things Policy, Takshashila's daily public policy podcast. I'm Anupam Manur. Sooner or later, every country gets hit. A war, a pandemic, a shipping lane that closes, or a bank that goes down. And the instinct for most governments, when the world turns dangerous, is to reach for protection. Make it at home, hold the currency steady, and erect trade barriers. Ajay Shah, my guest today, thinks that this instinct gets resilience almost exactly backwards. What lets a country absorb a blow, he argues, is a set of far less glamorous things. Prices that are allowed to move, institutions that can refuse a bad idea at the moment everyone is frightened, and of course, money in the bank. None of which can be assembled once a crisis has arrived at your shores. So, when the next crisis comes, and it will, what will India have to absorb it with? Ajay Shah is one of India's most consequential economists. He has worked inside the Ministry of Finance, spent years at NIPFP, and is a co-founder of the XKDR Forum in Mumbai. With Vijay Kelkar, he wrote In Service of the Republic, perhaps the most serious book we have on how the Indian state actually works. He's also that rare economist who will travel from the primary deficit to military drones to the future of the rupee inside a single answer, which is precisely what this conversation demanded. Turbulence, Global Finance and Geoeconomics in an Age of Disruption is a special series of Takshashila's All Things Policy podcast. This series is made possible by the generous support of Zerota. Somewhere in the world, as you're still listening to this, a financial crisis is perhaps underway. By Ajay Shah's reckoning, there are something like 5 of them every year. It could be a banking crisis, somewhere seizing up, a currency breaking. It could be a government discovering that it can no longer roll over its debt. Maybe 5 a year, maybe less, but some of them we would never even hear about. But all of this tells us something kind of interesting. The idea that you don't know when a crisis can arrive, and you don't know when it lands and how it lands, and then how do we get out of it. In 1929, a crash happened in a stock exchange. We all know about this. This became the Great Depression. It took roughly a third of the American banking system along with it, and arguably ran a direct line to Second World War. I am more interested, and I've been thinking a lot about this, how 2008 seems to be the pivotal year in recent memory of how a single particular crisis led to a spate of events after that. You had the Eurozone crisis, you had Brexit, you had Trump and a whole bunch of right-wing authoritarian leaders rising to ascendancy. COVID, of course, hit in between, but then you had Trump version 2. All of this, Ajay, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but all of this somehow leads back to 2008 as the single kind of differentiator in recent history. The difference between all of this is that the outcomes are not always the same. You can have a crisis, you can have different outcomes, and some of that could be perhaps on the absorptive capacity of different states and even the global system. So, Ajay, we're going to be talking about all of this and more. I'm going to start with just that question that that I asked recently, which is, if crises are so similar and they keep happening so frequently, what makes the outcome so wildly different? Or are they even different? You can correct me on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could go into a categorization of financial crises, but that's not really interesting and relevant. Equally, there are other kinds of things. Okay, look at the blockage of the Persian Gulf. Okay, never in our memory did we have that kind of event earlier. And here we are posing something new. So I think there is a wide variety of things that happen. In terms of how the world has become more messy, sometimes it is called the age of chaos. Sometimes it is called the age of polycrisis, where things have become much more difficult. I think it's important to understand some big things that led us here, just so that we can understand this world better. So after the fall of the USSR in 1989, everybody was far more optimistic that now we are finished with the Cold War. We are finished with the ideological battles around liberal democracy and free markets. Okay, and the world will find its feet and everything will become hunky-dory. And in a way it did. Okay, for many, many years, things worked great. And then they didn't quite work so great. So what changed? What are the big factors at work? In my mind, there are basically two stories going on. The first is the story of China. China built a certain kind of economy. It's a state controlled, industrial policy directed economy where there are things that just don't sit well with any conception of a globalized market economy. Okay. And China is a systemically big actor. So, this combination of non market practices in the hands of a systemically big actor turned into a big mess, and it created a global crisis where, in many, many countries, it undermined the interest of participation and political support for the globalization project itself. Okay, that was something very new. Nobody had imagined. Today, something like 30% of global manufacturing happens in China. This is really huge and new. The only previous episode of so much manufacturing being concentrated in one country that we know from before is the United States, where at the end of the Second World War, something like 40% of world GDP was in the United States. Other than that, we've really not seen a situation like this. And we've never seen an important country like this be a fundamentally non market actor engaged
Yeah.
in industrial policy, engaged in subsidies. When Paul Krugman wrote theoretical papers around new trade theory, they were considered just theoretical papers. The idea that there can be a country where there is one government and the government subsidizes an industry, that industry has increasing returns to scale, it kills off all global rivals, and then it starts recouping the profits. Okay, that whole thought process did not exist in the world until we got to China. Okay, so this is the first big new thing. It's a large non-market actor. It's a systemically important non-market actor. This is new. We were not ready for this. We don't know what to do about it. I have some opinions, but I put it up as a fundamental break compared to the world we knew before. The second fundamental break we found in the world was, in my opinion, the rise of social media. Okay,
Okay.
social media is the turning point. It's about 2010 or so where adoption rates of social media became really large all over the world. And social media fundamentally changed the nature of society. Um, we got more polarization, we got more anger, we got more ability for bad actors to run propaganda campaigns. Okay, it could be an IT cell, it could be Vladimir Putin Internet Research Agency, it could be anybody. I mean, there's a long list of bad actors who run propaganda campaigns, but it's a whole new phenomenon where in the trusted environment of your home, quietly you are sitting down and toxic messages are being beamed into your skull. It was a whole new phenomenon which had never happened before. I also think a lot about how social media fundamentally messed with the structure of society and the nature of the role of the elite and of Sanskritization. So let me put this up step by step. At first, we had an elite dominated world, and that worked reasonably well. In the jargon of political science, we should use the word political settlement. There was a political settlement where, of course, there was inequality. Inequality has been a fact of nature. Power and wealth were highly unequally distributed, and things worked out reasonably okay. And there was an intellectual elite, there was a cultural elite. There was a process of Sanskritization. The great sociologists M.N. Srinivas and Andre Bate, the two best thinkers on sociology in India, have showed us how poor people look up to the elite and they form culture and values and preferences based on elite behavior. So when the Indian elite walked out of the caste system and started doing intercaste marriages and interreligious marriages, then that was the most powerful force of modernization that you could get because of Sanskritization. And Sanskritization is about others looking up to an elite. Okay. This whole thing was broken down by social media in two directions. One was that when rich people posted photographs of their vacation in an island in Greece, it just created more envy than ever before. So earlier, there was always inequality, but the inequality took place behind a high wall, and it was easier to be Gandhian about it. And mothers could bring up their children saying, you care about yourself, you don't look at other people. Envy is not a good value. It is one of the seven deadly sins. You focus on yourself. Okay. Whereas when the carefully curated best parts of my life are thrust into your feed, then it becomes harder to be kind and comfortable. Note, this is an entirely unrealistic picture of the world. Okay, these are carefully curated vignettes of the best parts of each person's life are put up on social media, but it changed the nature of the word envy, and it undermined the old political settlement where humankind had learned how to digest inequality and live with it and get along and make progress. And we've had very high inequality all through the period after the Renaissance. All human progress came out of those environments of high inequality. By and large, the social justice people, the Marxism, was kept under check. These were relatively soft voices in the body politic, and the world had built a stable political settlement. That broke down when social media came along, and the envy became much bigger, and then the Marxism, the hatred, the anger, the social justice, all that came to fore much more prominently. The second thing that came with social media was that we lost the Sanskritization because people spend more time looking at their peers and looking at idiot things called influencers. So you really stop looking up to the world. And I saw a cartoon a long time ago where in the 50s, a small child in America says that when I grow up, I want to be an astronaut. And today, the small child says that when I grow up, I want to be on America's Got Talent, or I want to be an influencer, or something like that. Just the concept of looking up to your betters and elders has broken down. And people are comfortable looking at each other and doing TikTok gags on each other. And then you really don't get the better angels of our nature reshaping the environment in a bigger way. So I feel these factors came together and really messed with politics, messed with liberal democracies in a fundamental way.
Perfect. I mean, I already have so many threads that I can pull upon. I'll save China for later. And I really didn't think we'd be talking about social media in the Turbulence series. I think
Can
it's
I just finish? And then I want to put up number three. So I want to say three big things in the world have changed. I said two. I want to say three big things in the world have changed. The first was the rise of a non-market actor, China. The second was the breakdown of the old political settlement. Okay, so we had an old political settlement for 100 years. We fought off the social justice crowd. Okay, we fought off the Marxism in the 20th century. So remember, the word Nazi stands for nationalist socialist. It is the same rubbish all over again. We
yeah.
fought off the Nazis, we fought off the Marxists, we found the middle road. Okay, the center did hold. Okay, everybody should go read the poem. And suddenly it seems like we lost all that. That I blame social media. I think of social media as a critical causal factor that disrupted the world in all the ways that I just described. And the third factor is the social media led return of social justice, of nationalism, of hatred, of polarization that got us back to Donald Trump. Okay, and Donald Trump took America out of the global system. Now, America is an essential power. America was an essential power. America is an essential power. America led the globe. America protected the sea lanes. United States Navy ran freedom of navigation cruises, which ensured that sea lanes stayed open. We in India were the great beneficiaries because first the British and then the Americans kept the Red Sea open, and then we got the beauty of the Suez Canal working in our favor. Okay, the entire global system was based on American leadership. As an example, I want you to look back at a story called the ozone layer. Okay, so you will remember that freon in refrigeration leads to leakages into the atmosphere, which were breaking down the ozone layer.
CFCs, right? So
Yes,
chlorofluorocarbons.
chlorofluorocarbons, out of which the most famous is freon.
Yeah.
And the West led an agreement where all the countries, including India, agreed to shut down their CFC production. And the ozone layer problem was solved. And that's the power of what American leadership could do. And we have not been able to do that with climate change because we lost that American leadership. So, in the hands of Trump, we lost America. Okay, so, in a way, we are in a very bad world. You have a war in Ukraine, you have a war in Iran, all these things would not have happened in the old America. And this is very, very costly for the whole world. So, if I had to think about this age of chaos, this poly crisis, and think of the fundamental causal factors, I would say these three things: that a non-market economy, China, became big. That is bad for the world. It is a bloody mess. We should not have large non-market economies. You can be North Korea, you can be dinky non-market economies, it's irrelevant. But large
Yeah.
non-market economies are dangerous and bad for the world. The second was the rise of social media, which undermined the political settlement, which brought the old problems of Marxism and nationalism and social justice back to the fore. And the third is we lost America. America was the essential power that held up the old world from 1945 to 2016.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, the third point that you mentioned was where I was going with this. I want to see if there is China's a bad actor is one. My forming hypothesis, as I'm just listening to you, is that the second and third are interrelated, right? Which is that we know that social media can amplify your political crises, but does it also amplify financial crisis? How does it play out in the economy? Would Trump be doing all of these tariff policies if we were not living in the age of social media? Is that the social media led polarization naturally lead to populist measures, populist policy, which in turn has its own set of repercussions, all of this, right? So you did mention about the elite and now the loss of the Sanskritization process, right? Now you do have I remember, again, you could revisit this, but I remember your definition of what even populism means, which is the actual fight against the elite.
Yeah.
So has social media kind of triggered that? And does that play out in not just the politics, which I think is reasonably well understood, but does it also play out in economy and finance? These are, again, I'm just asking you questions.
No, I agree with you. This is an important issue. So consider what happens in any financial crisis. There are some large important firms and markets that are going to go down.
Yeah.
And you could say that the government should do absolutely nothing and let those organizations and or market systems blow up. That's pretty expensive. So, for example, we saw in the Great Depression, a third of the American banking system went under, and that was very, very costly for society. Now, it is cost efficient for the people when public money is used to rescue some financial firms and some financial markets. It's not always true. Yeah, I think the death of some firms is very important. Otherwise, it creates moral hazard. But it is cost efficient for society when some public money is used in some ways. So I want to give you an example. I was a very big critic of government money being used to bail out UTI. Okay? I did a public debate against M. Damodaran, who was the leader of UTI, brought in to deal with the mess, brought in to deal with the crisis. There was a big public meeting in Bombay with 500 people. And I said, what's wrong with UTI going down? UTI should burn. Okay, there's nothing wrong with the closure of UTI. Damodaran said that you are not being correct. He said that this is actually a temporary problem and in time it will work out. And if the government will give a helping hand to overcome this mess, net, the cost to the taxpayer will be zero. And there will be many people in the country who will actually be better off by doing that. Okay. And oddly enough, shortly after that, I got appointed into the Ministry of Finance to work on the UTI crisis. And we did work out a burden sharing formula where some costs were imposed on the people, on the investors in UTI, and some costs were borne by the government. So, okay, it was not pure moral hazard that some costs were imposed upon the investors in UTI, but some costs were borne by the taxpayer. And I was a grumbling skeptic. See, I was age 35. So you have romantic views at age 35. And I was a big critic of that work that I was a part of. Meaning, in all the meetings, I tried to bargain public money down. My bias was, let us not put public money. If people should suffer, the investors in UTI will think twice tomorrow when they lend their money to a government organization, was my hope, was my dream. Many, many years later, when you do the balance sheet correctly, M. Damodaran was right and I was wrong. On a mark-to-market basis, the government made a profit out of its intervention in UTI.
Right.
Okay. So this is an important lesson that needs to also be on the table, that net, the United States federal government did great in its interventions into the 2008 crisis. But the headlines look toxic that $500 billion went to the fat cats. And the Marxists, the Nazis, the social media crowd, the social justice crowd got to jump on that and say, see, these rich people, they have yachts, they own an island, and public money is being used to give them money, while the government says at the same time, we don't have money to give pensions to old people. Yeah. So this is toxic messaging, which went wide on social media at the time. So, yes, I agree with you that a financial crisis is a particularly unpleasant combination of this explanation that is hard to do. Okay, and I'm narrating to you my story.
Yeah, yeah,
I was far more hawkish. Today, I'm relatively supportive that to protect the financial system, to stabilize the economy, overall net the cost benefit just works out that it is good to use some taxpayer money with care, with caution, not to bail people out extremely, but modest uses of ministry of finance purse in coping with some financial crisis has its benefits. I'm not puritanical about it. You should impose some costs on private people also,
yeah,
so as to contain the moral hazard. You should not protect people completely. But when you do this, it is an intense communication challenge. How do you explain it in the age of social media is a huge problem, because this can very readily turn into anti elite rhetoric
yeah,
and undermine the political settlement and create problems for the country. It can fuel support for the two extremes, for the left extreme and the right extreme. The two kinds of crazies in the world both develop greater popularity. And then on top of that, in America, just our bad luck that Obama was the president, and that fueled white racism. So the hatred of white people, of some white people against a half black president, fueled the right wing anger in America, and these things came together and they gave us Donald Trump.
yeah. That's the entire arc, and I'm saying I think we can see much more of that in every single episode today. I think just to kind of close the bracket on this, you have Trump announcing tariffs, which are very popular with the American voters. And just taking from your hypothesis, I would imagine that a lot of this is also done for that signaling. It's done for show. And I think that is where social media plays a much bigger role than it would have earlier.
So I do want to say that in the narrow story you said, normally protectionism is always popular amongst dumb people. Okay, so 99% of the people don't understand economics. And when a government stands up and says, how can I let our workers go out of job? How can I allow foreigners to compete with Indian tomatoes? It's always popular. Remarkably enough, in the polling, the support for Trump on trade policy is not good. So
Right.
even in the right wing mob's ability to carry messaging through social media into American voters, the support for Trump on a whole bunch of issues has declined dramatically. The support for Trump on trade is down to a core Republican base of maybe 25 to 30% of the population. It is not something that has worked out too well for him in terms of politics, which I think is a reassuring sign that even in the modern social media age, he has not been able to get through to more than 25-30% of the American voters.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to come to the heart of the episode. So this is I want to get into slightly categorization territory, or even probably explanatory territory, which is when we're talking about resilience, Ajay. I want you to give a fair idea to our listeners of what does resilience look like. We spoke about shock absorbers. So you have a crisis that hits, and then obviously different states and different systems have different capacities to kind of absorb that shock, but the fragility underneath is what really kind of determines that, right? So so I'm gonna, we can think about just by your previous writings, by other things that you've done. You've got price flexibility, institutional redundancy, and diversification, right? So these are the three kind of the bedrock. But let's take Indian context, or Hormuz, and say, how does this play out? What are the actual mechanisms which these play out?
So I would put up three categories of sources of resilience. I'm making this up right now as we speak. I would put it up as factor market flexibility,
Okay.
that the working of prices and labor and so on. Then the second thing that I would put up is the ability of the institutional apparatus to resist all the short term populist measures that will inevitably be proposed. So that's more a mental, intellectual resilience and the strength of the political system in coping with bad situations. So I always say you should be terrified in a crisis because the worst ideas will come to the fore. And the third I would put up is just sheer financial strength. Okay, so let's go into each of these. Fair? Okay, so I'm just putting up a classification scheme. Factor markets. Second is the resilience of the mind when faced with the toxic ideas that come up in bad environment. And the third is financial strength. So let's start at the first. Factor price flexibility, price flexibility. What you want is market based adjustments. Okay, shocks are real. Human beings like to cling to yesterday. Human beings like that my day today should be the same as what it was yesterday. I had some work, I had some income, I had some job, I had some payment for my petrol. Okay, humans want fixity, but the world changes, and a good country is one where things fluctuate. Okay, the exchange rate is the most important price of all. It is the shock absorber of the economy. So when the war in Iran began, in my mind, it was crystal clear that there are two tests we need for petroleum product prices in India to go up so as to generate demand side adjustments in India. It should be expensive. If the world price of petrol goes up, then the domestic price of petroleum products should go up. And the second is the exchange rate. That if it's an adverse shock to India in so many ways, then INR should depreciate. That's a shock absorber because then Indian exports become more competitive and imports become more expensive. And that's the market based adjustment, the price adjustment. Similarly, the adjustment of factor markets more generally. Here, by and large, India does well because the bulk of the labor market is not in the formal sector. Okay, the bulk of the Indian labor market is in the informal sector, where there is price flexibility, there is hire and fire. By the way, I remember in 2008 when the crisis came, there were many IT companies in India where management had open, comfortable discussions with workers, and there was a candid conversation that we could either sack people or we could cut wages, and many companies chose to cut wages, and it was a very healthy response. In the economics textbooks, we are told that there is a Keynesian rigidity, which is wage rigidity. But in India, it was actually possible to cut wages when faced with a crisis. And that's a very healthy response. That's the way good organizations should be. It's the way good countries should be. So I give India high marks on the labor market flexibility because the bulk of the labor is in the informal sector. So the formal sector is a bloody mess. The structures, the concepts of labor law are reasonably harmful, and that interferes with Indian economic growth. But when it comes to flexibility, we're doing relatively okay. India is also a country where, unlike China, there are no barriers to migration. So people move around the country. When there was a disaster in COVID, people went back home to their village. Okay, these are equilibrating responses, and it's good for the resilience of the overall society. Okay, so this is my pillar one: price flexibility, factor market flexibility. Then part two, there's a lot of traction in India that India will only reform in a crisis. Rahm Emanuel, the amazing American politician, has a beautiful line. He says, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." He's riffing on the American line, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." So he made it, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." And I actually see the world very differently, particularly in an Indian setting. When institutions are weak, a crisis is a terrible thing. Mistakes are held back by checks and balances.
Right.
What we want is a political system that imposes checks and balances. In a crisis, the checks and balances tend to peel away. So you think of checks and balances of politics, of what politicians think, of what parliamentarians and legislators think, of the willingness of the courts to intervene, of the media, of the researchers, of the intellectuals. All these checks and balances tend to get suspended in a crisis. In a crisis, we all become tribalistic. We want some big man or some big woman to tell us what to do and take leadership, take control of the situation. This is a primeval response of humans. And the removal of the checks and balances leads to terrible things over and over in world history. Okay, the Reichstag fire was a crisis that was used by Hitler to suspend the constitution and consolidate power and put his enemies into concentration camps. Again and again in history, you see that the worst things are done in a crisis. So I would not wish a crisis upon my worst enemies. I totally disagree. This is Indian middle class drawing room chatter. It is the lack of knowledge of politics in India, where people want a strong leader, where people shake their heads and say India will only reform in a crisis. Yeah, like please, we've got to figure out how to reform every day so that we get checks and balances. We got lucky with Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh and Ashok Desai. Okay, you should not feel confident that a crisis will generate good outcomes. A crisis can generate terrible outcomes.
Yeah.
And we have seen very toxic things being done around crisis. We have seen crisis turning into very bad events for the country. So I just want to put this up as a basic piece of political science knowledge that a society works better when there are more checks and balances, not less. When you want more restraints upon the executive, where the prime minister should have the least possible power, then that's where a country works best, where strong leaders are seen as a problem and not as something desirable. Okay, so this is my pillar two, which is checks and balances and the dangers of bad ideas coming up. So, in every crisis, there will be at least five left economists who will say, now we need higher customs tariffs.
Yeah.
So, protectionism comes back, industrial policy comes back. Okay, every low knowledge person will reach for industrial policy, saying, see, Obama protected General Motors in 2008. This proves that in the crisis, government should do this, government should do that. And for my pet industry, for my favorite industry, I need 50,000 crore to come from the government. So, just how to be the fish tank cleaner, so that you have to continuously circulate the bad ideas of the country into a public square. And we need enough tireless think tankers like people in Takshashila to not get tired, to not get bored, and keep shooting down bad ideas. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
very important function. Like, I tend to prize novelty and I try to write a new thing every day. But I recognize that many times you just have to write the old things over and over.
Oh,
So it isn't done when it's been written 20 years ago.
Ajay, I think I have about 13 different op-eds just condemning price controls. I mean, that's just like staple. I can publish
Yeah.
one in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. It comes out automatically. But
Yeah.
yes.
And we need more of us. Okay. So we need more people who
Yeah.
will do this housekeeping work of policing the public sphere. And particularly in India, where there are perfectly articulate English speakers who really have abysmal knowledge of politics and economics, then it's doubly dangerous because it is so easy to go into industrial policy, great leader, government monopoly, government should do this, we need a sovereign LLM. Yeah, this kind of nonsense just takes off very readily in the latent Indian socialism. Like, we have not yet exorcised the ghost of Nehru and Mahalanobis, and it keeps coming back in one form after another. So this
Yeah.
was claim two. And my claim three for what generates resilience is financial strength. Okay, so Vijay Kelkar used to always say the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. In good times, we as a society, which includes individuals and corporations and financial system and government, okay, all four need to run a tight ship. Okay, we should have high savings rates. We should build asset balances. We should not have too much leverage, not in the wrong places. We should not have important financial firms, which are frankly a pack of cards where one small wind will blow them off. And most important, we need a government that is fiscally prudent, that is fiscally safe. Okay? And India is in very bad shape on the last one. Here's my quick summary of what constitutes fiscal prudence. There is a beautiful number that is called the primary deficit. Okay,
Yeah.
right now, I don't want to belabor the technical issues, but I want all our readers to be able to focus in any budget statement on the primary deficit. It is the most interesting, most important measure that should be used as an operational check for how public finance is faring. For 8 out of 10 years, the primary deficit should be a surplus. It can be a small surplus. It can be 0.2% of GDP. You don't need big surpluses. But for 8 out of 10 years, there should be a small primary surplus that constitutes healthy public finance. In India, we have unhealthy public finance because if you take a 10-year average of the primary deficit, it is probably about 2.5%. So we are probably 2.7% away from where we need to be. We need an adjustment of 2.5 to 3% of GDP to get to the safe zone. And what are the symptoms of this? What we see is year after year, the Indian debt GDP only goes up, it doesn't go down. I will always warn everybody that are you really sure you measure the Indian GDP correctly?
Yeah.
Maybe if the Indian GDP is overestimated, then the debt GDP is worse than we think. Maybe it's not 90%, maybe it's 100%, maybe it's 110%. And that would be far more scary.
Yeah.
And we have the bulk of the government money going away into contracted things like interest payments. All these are symptoms of a lack of financial strength. So financial strength is not I am a poor country, so we are weak. Financial strength is the government should live within its means. Poor people should live within their means. The small firms of a small country should live within their means. The financial system should be robust. None of this is excusable because we are a poor country. In a poor country, it is possible to be financially prudent.
Yeah. So, just for Ajay, if you don't mind, I'm just going to explain to the listeners. Primary deficit is basically your deficit minus interest payments, and in India, that's quite large. So of course, I don't think India is anywhere close to kind of breaking the DOMA debt condition, etc., where your nominal GDP rate is not sufficient to kind of just pay off your interest payment. But it is, yeah, it is worrisome. It is big. It's not really going. But on the second part, you do have, yeah. Maybe GDP overestimation, you do have fiscal deficit underestimation. Some of it has been consolidated, you think, in the recent past, but there's still
I want to tell this to you,
yeah.
not as a debt sustainability test as we do it in economic theory. I want to sell this to you at a bigger level. I want to bring up the word strategic depth.
Okay.
Okay. What we should be after is strategic depth. Shit happens. And for bad events, we need fiscal space.
Yeah.
Okay. A bad event can be a war. A bad event can be a pandemic.
COVID.
A
Yeah.
bad event can be the closure of the Persian Gulf. A bad event is coming in terms of the catastrophes and natural disasters associated with climate change. Okay. When the seas rise, a third of Bangladesh will get flooded. Okay. There's going to be a refugee crisis in India, and so on. So I'm not narrowly saying that you need to always pay down your debt. Yes, you do. But a country that is able to keep its public finance in balance and not build up large subsidy systems like we in India are is a country where the state has strategic depth. So here I'm going to distinguish between the people and the state. The state is our agent. If the state runs a tight ship fiscally, then the state will have the ability to mount a response. So I want to take you back to the pandemic. The pandemic was a catastrophe. It was absolutely horrible for a lot of people in India. Their incomes went to zero. Okay, it was an unbelievable disaster. I don't want to dilute things. There was an extreme economic catastrophe when the extreme lockdown came. Okay, we can debate whether alternative measures could have been used, but there was an economic catastrophe. Now, many people looked at other countries, most notably the United States, and saw the very large fiscal responses of the United States government. And they wondered that, we're India, could we do the same? Should we do the same? Okay, I was not in the room, but I have heard secondhand stories about how Mr. Modi responded to these kinds of calls. And Mr. Modi said two things. The first is that, okay, you want to do a big fiscal stimulus right now. Persuade me that you will not need a big fiscal stimulus next year. Who is to know how long the pandemic will last? Who is to know when this monster will turn? Okay, like none of us anticipated the second wave.
Yeah.
Okay, so who's to know when things get better? Is it better to keep your powder dry? Is it better to spend now? Okay, and I say, wow, that was a wise proposition. And part two, Mr. Modi is instinctively careful about public finance, and I say, yeah, that's a good way to be. But I disagree with his level of instinct because his level of instinct is still 2.5 to 3 percentage points of GDP of the deficit away from where it ought to be year after year. With his conservatism, we are at 2.53 away from where we ought to be. So I think that having strategic depth is a great thing. The United States was able to really materially improve the lives of its people by launching a large scale response to COVID in a way that was not available to the Indian state. Mr. Modi was correct that
Correct.
in the Indian environment, it made no sense to try to be like the United States. Okay? Why? You must go down and ask why. Not because we're a poor country, because we're a country where public finance has not been managed well, because the financial system doesn't have the depth, our financial repression system, we don't have voluntary lenders to the government, money is coerced out of the financial system to give it to the government. All those root causes are the reason why we don't have strategic depth. So I want to use the word strategic depth. It's a good organizing principle when we
Yeah.
think of crisis. It includes war, it includes a financial crisis, it includes a pandemic, it includes shit happens in an unpredictable way. So none of us even have the taxonomy of what future crises will look like. But then I would be much happier if we in India, on the public policy side, would basically go after two big elements of the agenda: get the debt GDP down to 50% of GDP with correct measurement of GDP, and get all the borrowing of the government from voluntary lenders. There should be no financial repression system.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
present, 95% of the borrowing of the Indian state is coerced out of various kinds of financial firms. This
Yeah.
is taxation. It is not honest borrowing. And again, it's penny wise, pound foolish. It is short termist. Again, think of the word strategic depth. Think of the UK in the First World War and the Second World War. The UK government went to the bond market and said, guys, will you lend to me? And the bond market said, sure, you give me a higher interest rate, I will lend to you. And the UK government was able to borrow like 150% of GDP to fight the First World War and 200% of GDP to fight the Second World War. Please note these numbers: 150% of GDP, 200% of GDP. That's what makes a great country. In India, there would be no discussion beyond 3% of GDP.
Yeah, yeah. And that is only possible because during normal times they kept their purses clean. If you keep overspending during normal times, you lose the trust of the lenders, you lose the trust of, I mean, even ordinary citizens, right? And then you also then have to get it through financial repression, through the banking channels, so a whole bunch of things, which will,
So I want to use the British story that uh, what I have said is old British public finance prudence, that don't borrow to pay interest. That's not acceptable.
yeah, yeah,
Fair and square, you should run a small primary surplus every year. So when you look at the long time series of the British debt GDP, you see a huge surge only for wars. It was a
right.
Napoleonic War. There was a huge surge in debt. You start paying that down. So 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. After that, you start paying that down. Then in the Crimean War, you get a small surge. 40% of GDP was borrowed to pay for the Crimean War. And then you start paying it down. Then for the First World War, they borrowed 150% of GDP. And they started paying that down. Then for the Second World War, they borrowed 200% of GDP. And by the late 80s, it was all paid down. Okay? It is only in British socialism and the welfare state that you lose this kind of clarity.
Right. Ajay, we are talking about strategic debt and shock
Depth,
absorbers. Depth.
that is depth, yeah.
Yeah. And shock absorbers, right? So I want to kind of go from there to, again, strategic thinking and planning and depth for both at the national level and at the firm level. For firms, the idea that, of course, globalization looked very pretty from, you pick 1989 to, let's say, 2008, where supply chains were very predictable. You could get whatever, and so it was all efficiency based. We know that the trade off between resilience and efficiency exists, and at some point you have to do the same. So was that a strategic failure, that firms over thought about the efficiency part, didn't really build other alternatives in terms of their supply chains, and if they were caught out in, let's say, in, when Trump came about in either 2016 or later, is that just the price that they have to pay for lack of strategic thinking, or is there
Well,
something else to the story? And
if
I'll
you,
just, the second part is on the national level, and especially for a country like India. I had written in 2013, 2014 onwards that we have to build a strategic petroleum reserve, strategic LPG reserves, and so on. And all of that makes sense now when the crisis hits. But back then, many people would argue that it was wasteful resources. I mean, use of resources when you already obviously have competing, uses for that, right? So, and it could be many, many such things. It could be the stockpiling of vaccines. It could be stockpiling of something else. But that strategic argument, how do you square off the two?
I want to say two, three things. The first is that hindsight is 2020.
Yeah.
If you and I were in the euphoria of the fall of the USSR, what would we have said? We would have said we are done. Okay. Now liberal democracy and free markets is going to reshape the world as it did for a long, long time. Okay. If you look back until Tiananmen Square, when the Chinese government decided to kill 5,000 of its own people, there was even a good chance that communism was going to collapse in China as well. Okay. So we were in full euphoria that this world is getting better. And it made sense to optimize for that world.
Yeah.
And then the world changed. I put up the date as 2016, that when Donald Trump came to power, the world changed. And by 2018, you get the effects, which is the China tariffs. Okay, so the first deglobalization of the world began in 2018. And my mental model is we had a great run from 1989 till 2016.
Okay.
That's my dating of the happy period, the happy days, as some German submariners would say. So now the world has changed. Now our trade-offs change. So what would you do in the world of business? You hinted at supply chain resilience, that if you have only one supplier located in China, you're making a mistake. Okay, you need 3 suppliers in 3 different countries. That kind of thing is very much a good idea, and it will come at a cost. Yeah. And every company needs to reevaluate the bias variance trade-off of its supply chain, the mean variance trade-off of its supply chain, and it will make sense to favor more resilience. That's a good thing. So I'm sure every business person is doing this. It took a while for people to blink their eyes and realize how amazing the world was after the fall of the USSR. See, business people don't think enough about politics.
Yeah.
We had all normalized the existence of the USSR, that there will always be this baleful glare. And so when the USSR collapsed, most business people didn't understand how profoundly the world had changed. It took strategic thinking to understand that, wow, now we are in a different place and we can build differently, we can do differently. So it took strategic thinking in that time to predict in 1989 that now India will have to change. Okay? In hindsight, it's 2020 that Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh would take India out of the Soviet camp, would take India out of socialism and start becoming more globalized, would connect up India into globalization, would cut tariffs, would remove capital controls. But the really clever people are those who understood that in 1989. Okay? And I want to say for me personally, it was a hope that now we'll be able to go back and say to social justice people in India that look how badly the USSR worked out, and don't you think we should be a little more capitalist? Okay, it was a hope. It was not a certainty. I was not sure it's going to work, but I thought that, yeah, now the balance of the argument will tilt, and now India will become better, because many of the social justice people who would hold up the USSR as a credible alternative for how to organize a society would realize that it was actually hollow inside. Like the way today we get China boosters. Okay, the China boosters are people who are not deeply understanding the horror of an authoritarian country and the failures that are hidden inside a propaganda machine. So we didn't get bad news stories out of the USSR. We only got good news stories out of the USSR. So we all overestimated the USSR. So it is with China. If you're a Chinese language speaking foreign scholar, if you are an unbiased estimator, you won't get visas to travel to China. So there is a systematic bias that the Chinese language speaking scholars who get the permission to travel to China are the ones who are more pro-China, who are more optimistic about China, who put more gloss on China. And so systematically, our picture of China is biased in favor of greater optimism about China. So that same sort of thing was happening there also. And I think that the world has changed, and our job, okay, you and me and all of us in our research community, we the thinkers have to be the leaders in understanding this world. And then practical people will be able to slowly get that knowledge diffused out of us. Now the world has changed. And so my summary of the world today is we've lost the United States for leadership on security arrangements. So there will be more wars and more violence and more deaths and more killings because various random tin pot actors will do more strange things. Okay. So if you think Doklam and Galwan was bad, it's
You
just a
have.
beginning because the checks and balances against China have diminished. Okay. So this is a more messy world in terms of physical security and violence and military affairs and conflicts. Like war in Iran, war in Ukraine is only the beginning. The second is that the international trade system that was organized around American leadership, where there would be agreements on problems like the ozone layer, that is gone. Now it is sort of like each man for himself. And now each country has to dig into its shoes and find sanity and talent and capability. Now there's a greater risk of countries becoming stupid. So, for example, for India, okay, for India, I would claim that there is merit in a high amount of protectionism in certain fields against China. For the rest, it remains the case for India that we should do free trade. We should just open up everything to globalization, to all the rich countries, including America. Like America will be stupid, but that hasn't changed the benefits to India. So even if Americans do stupid things against us, there is no benefit for us to do stupid things against American imports. Okay? And for the rest, there are plenty of OECD countries. The West is full of countries who do normal, sane, old style things, and we should engage with them more. Uh, we are very pleased about the British Free Trade Agreement or the European Union Free Trade Agreement. They are pieces of progress by Indian standards, but they are not actually free trade agreements by global standards. They are not deep trade agreements. They are riddled with limitations to free trade. And so we as a country have to find the intellectual consensus and the intellectual power to understand this difficult landscape and learn what is optimal for us in India in this difficult world.
And it's even more difficult now than ever before because, I mean, even when the world was at its peak globalization, the argument for a free trade system within India was always going to be difficult. Now, critiques can just point to the United States and say, if they're being so protectionist, why shouldn't we? Right. So,
Yeah,
I mean, the just challenge of this is just so much bigger.
yeah.
Um, but I want to come to China because you did mention China. I mean, there's so many different threads I can pick on, but let's go to China. I don't want you to repeat either your particular column with Ila Patnaik. The China is a market failure, therefore we need trade barriers. Nor I thoroughly enjoyed your episode with Deepak on the Deepak disagrees because again it goes into some of these things in detail. So let's try and not replicate that. But I have just one or two questions further to that. So for listeners, I would of course deeply suggest that you go back and both read that piece and listen to this. One thing that I took away from Ajay personally is that I think in all of this, we can't be ideologues saying, okay, free trade always good or trade barriers always bad. I think you came across as and if I may say this, surprisingly, a very practical, you need to go by the merit of the situation types. And with China, especially, I think that is the problem. So there is obviously a lot of China can be a market failure for a whole bunch of things, whether it's IP theft and cybercrime. You have the entire thing about heavy state subsidies. I think the core idea is that there is an irreversibility that manufacturing knowledge can get lost with China acting the way that it does. And then it might take more than a generation, etc., to rebuild. With all of this, we say that you need some form of trade barriers. It need not be tariffs, but some form of trade barriers. Do you want to add just two lines to that before I get to my questioning part?
I agree with everything you said. If you wish, I can do my today's summary statement of the elements of logic. And you said I sound very practical. Basically, I believe in first principles thinking,
Yeah.
that there is never a sweeping ideological answer. You've got to look at each situation, look at the evidence, and do first principles thinking. And then the answers will offend various camps. But I'm not in the business of being in any camp.
Yeah, yeah. No, please do. If you could just untangle the logic of the
So
entire
here
thing.
is a list of considerations, categories of considerations. Just so we'll start. Consider defense technology. If there's going to be a military drone in India, then it cannot have a single part originating in China
Yeah.
for both supply chain resilience and also backdoors and kill switches. Okay, so any electronics that is made in China comes with a credible threat of a kill switch or information leakage, and that is completely unacceptable. Pakistan is partly a less important actor for India today. Our dominant military threat is China, and partly Pakistan is fully woven into the Chinese system, as we saw in Operation Sindoor, that their equipment is all Chinese. And so, if I was China, I would want to infiltrate um, motors into Indian drones with a secret kill switch. And then I would want to test under battlefield conditions that does this work for the Pakistani military. So in an Op Sindhu type situation, this is a very valuable testing ground where the Chinese have been openly going and saying to the world that look at how well our equipment worked against Rafale in Operation Sindoor. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is case one, that we're going to do something military. It has to be absolutely immune to anything coming from China for reasons of supply chain resilience and for reasons of kill switch and data leakage. Just last week, there was information that there was one particular camera that was used on a British naval boat, and the researchers found that it was sending data back to China. And there was this
Right.
huge furor that how could
Yeah.
we trust a single drop of military equipment to come from China? And that, by the way, does not imply that we have to do self reliance. Okay. You heard me take the maximally hawkish stand here of
Yeah.
zero China. You must have zero China in the Indian military. That's a maximalist position. But then you have to ask yourself, how can I get that at minimum cost? And the answer is embrace the West.
Yeah.
Okay, the Europeans have the same objective, the Americans have the same objective, the South Koreans have the same objective, the Japanese have the same objective, the Taiwanese have the same objective, the Australians have the same objective, all Western countries have the same objective. So we just need to deeply embrace Western tech. And anyway, we are miles behind. So today's state of the art of conventional war is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine has the number one knowledge. All the Western companies working in Ukraine have that knowledge. And we've got to go get that knowledge. So the puzzle for Indian foreign policy is how to create conditions for deep Indian collaboration into the R&D and also the manufacturing. In this manufacturing problem, I wish to say there's actually a very important asset that India brings to the table, which is chip manufacturing for the ridiculous volumes that are required in global war. Okay, so who
Mhm.
would have imagined that the consumption of drones is 10,000 to 50,000 drones per day? They are like artillery shells, they are now consumable. So you need very high volumes. India is potentially a very good manufacturing giant to bring into this problem. With low cost labor, you could do manufacturing in India. If Hyundai makes cars in India, then Hyundai could make unmanned ground vehicles in India. And so there
Yeah.
is something useful to be done in India in these global partnerships. Okay, so by the way, South Korea, Poland, Ukraine is a very important defense collaboration that is now shaping up. And I would say India should be a fourth country in that, offering low cost manufacturing. The second amazing thing India brings to the table is geographical remoteness. Every factory in South Korea or Ukraine or Poland is within striking range of China, North Korea, and Russia. Okay. The beauty of South India is it's reasonably far away. So it's harder for a missile to get there. There would be more early warning for air defense. So you would set up a ring of radars at the Vindhyas and you would get enough time to protect facilities in the southern cone. So from all these points of view, India has some good things to offer. And now it is the art of foreign policy that what deal making would we do? Okay, you know me, I always criticize strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is the idea that I'll not make deals. Then you should not say that you're doing foreign policy or just doing speeches in the United Nations. Foreign policy is the business of making deals. That I give something, you give something, we come together, we make progress for both of us. So if the Indian state will go ask South Korea that we want ABCD from you in the space of defense, and the South Koreans will say, we want XYZ with you in agriculture policy, and we should be willing to negotiate. We should be willing to make deals that further Indian interests. It's Indian interests that are important, and interests are not always served by autonomy. Okay? So this is category one, which is military tech.
Yeah.
Okay, we very much need AI chips which are fully immune to China. And there's no hope in hell of any semiconductors happening in India. Sorry, Pranay. I respect and admire all the software engineers in Bangalore doing this stuff, but a full stack semiconductor ecosystem in India. It's not going to happen for 50 years. And so we need the sourcing that where are those AI chips going to come? Like $5 AI chips are required to sit on a $100 drone.
Yeah.
And we will not get this in India, but there are people elsewhere in the world doing this, and we should partner with them. Okay, category 2 are domestic strategic vulnerabilities. So we don't want Huawei switches inside any Indian telecom switch. Okay, so Nitin Pai, Ajit Ranade, and I wrote an article on the Leap blog where we argue that we should welcome Chinese involvement and investment in India into all the dumb things. So you build a highway, then it should be fully possible for the Chinese to own the highway. But if there's any electronics on the highway, it should be owned by somebody else. So we should not give the Chinese any surveillance capabilities to operate in India. Okay, so like that. Think in a logical way that what are physical assets? What are arm's length financial investments? So if the Chinese will be a financial investor of JNPT, we should be fine because you're just a shareholder. You get an annual report. You get to vote like anybody else. It doesn't give you any special access to either information or control. We should be fine with that. Okay, so this is category 2, that the vulnerability of the Indian systems against Chinese threats. It also means hardening Indian systems. Okay, so I've been in the Ministry of Finance where budgets were made without backups. Okay, I'm not kidding. That there were no computers in the Ministry of Finance which had a backup in my
Oh,
time.
wow.
So if you got a virus into the Ministry of Finance on the right dates, then the budget would have to be cancelled. Okay? And I'm very nervous about Chinese infiltration. So, getting data from AIMS is a triumph for a Russian or a Chinese attacker because they're getting detailed health records about all Indian civil servants and politicians. It's an absolutely amazing achievement for them in terms of building their intelligence dossiers on important people in India. But it is our job that we have to harden AIMS, we have to harden the power system, we have to harden the critical facilities like NSE and BSE, okay, and so on. So this is category 2, that harden the mainland in ways that make sure that Russian, Chinese attacks against India don't happen. Okay, so this is a category 2. Then comes category 3. This is industrial policy, which is very, very difficult. That what are the industries where in India there is the Paul Krugman new trade theory critique, where realistically, genuinely, there is a plausible globalized Indian industry that is able to pass the market test and export to the world. But it gets damaged by the craziness of Chinese government subsidies to exporters, and automobile components comes to my mind. That this is a place where India has passed the market test. We're not making this up. This is not like some semiconductor fantasy. This is proven that pure private Indian automobile component companies became globally competitive and they proved their worth by exporting. And then when you have this current crisis of the last 10 years of dumping by the Chinese, then it is really something to worry about. And there is a case for protectionism, at least to keep up that industry for some years until China implodes. So again, you have to play out, you have to have the waiting game. Like you had to wait out the implosion of the USSR.
Yeah.
You had to be able to look beyond the one-sided information that crept out of the USSR. Like that, we have to be able to look beyond the one-sided information that comes out of China, wait it out, and then the world will become a more normal place. But for right now, it helps that all the advanced economies of the world are putting up trade barriers against China. Okay.
Right.
Then you get to category 4, where really there is nothing much going on in India, or maybe there will not be much going on in India. And should you just accept a whole bunch of subsidized Chinese imports because we're not really meaningfully producing in India? The things that come to my mind are solar panels and lithium-ion batteries. Now, there you have to ask the question that will the Chinese switch off supply to India as a strategic threat? Okay.
Yeah.
So in solar panels, it's not that big a problem. It just means you won't build any new solar or photovoltaic generation plants using Chinese panels. You'll start buying panels from everywhere else in the world. Yeah, I don't see that as a showstopper. In the case of lithium-ion batteries, imagine an entire Indian automobile sector where every day cars and two-wheelers and trucks and ships are being shipped using lithium-ion batteries. Then, if the Chinese throw a switch and cut off lithium ion battery sales to India, does it mean an entire industry employing millions of people suddenly stops working? Okay, that is a threat. And we need to think about appropriate responses. And right now, I don't want to belabor what that ideal response will be. It can be a strategic reserve, etc. But these are four categories that I would put up. Finally, on your comment about strategic petroleum reserve, I want to hold up gas as a success story. Okay, we
Hmm.
had no meaningful gas reserve. The way the world works is that when the world price of gas goes up, the highest bidder buys up the scarce LNG tankers of the world.
Yeah.
That's all there is. So you get power cuts in Bangladesh because they do not have the money to buy LNG tankers. And we in India are able to buy LNG tankers because we are rich enough to pay for it. Okay.
Yeah.
So because India has a tiny elite which does software exports and Bangladesh does garment exports, India had the money, the hard currency through which, when the price of gas doubled and tripled, Indian buyers, both private or public, were able to go around the world and afford to buy up the tankers. And tankers did not go to Pakistan and Bangladesh, who South Asian countries did not have that Indian style extreme elite capability and were not exporting software. Okay, so that's again, please see the connections between equality and success. Okay, it is Indian inequality which gave us a tiny cadre of brilliant people who are software engineers who generated the exports, and with those export proceeds, we got the resilience. So I want to be careful about the word strategic reserves. Anything that can be bought in the world market at a 2x, 3x the price, really your best strategic protection is just money. Like, be rich.
Money.
Okay, have a strategic reserve of money. And then again comes back to all the fiscal stuff. The government should not be broke, so that in a time of crisis the government is able to put money on the table. The rupee should not be trembling, struggling with some artificial $50 billion FCNRB borrowing to prop up the rupee. The rupee should be a boisterous free market exchange rate where there are no difficulties. It's 120 to the dollar and we are not crying about it. Then you've got a safe, stable country.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. I think strategic reserves of money is the best bet. Just a slight, I don't know, question on again the China bit. A lot of what you said. I mean, I agree on the defense front. Of course, it makes complete sense. But just two or three questions on that. Right. One, can we afford to wait for the implosion of China? Is a lot of damage not already done by then? As I think you've mentioned, I mean, a lot of the tacit knowledge of just manufacturing, all of that could be lost, and then you have to rebuild that by the time China implodes. And macroeconomists have been predicting the downfall of China since even 2000s. And that's a crisis that's not come, or has been managed when it has come. So how long can we kind of just afford to wait? And on the Indian front, some of the things that you state, Ajay, I think requires a high degree of state capacity to have that discretionary ability to say, okay, this is a particular sector that needs protection in some sense against China. This is a sector that probably where we need to do industrial policy. This is a sector where we can allow Chinese investment, and this is a sector where we don't allow Chinese investment. Given India's broad record in this, where we like to do blanket bans, where we like to do, do we have that state capacity, and where can this go wrong?
These are very fair questions. Let me go bit by bit. First, no, I claim that I was a China hawk that came out right. Okay,
Okay.
so from Deng Xiaoping 1978 till Xi Jinping 2012 is indeed a shining Chinese success story. They were doing well.
Yeah.
And I was happy. I was waiting and hoping for China to become a normal, healthy, successful country like all others. And so I thought, okay, they are on a march to freedom, more and more economic freedom, more and more political freedom. They're becoming a better country. We're willing to ignore the murders of people that happened at Tiananmen Square. For the rest, China was making progress. But with the benefit of hindsight, we know that when you don't have constitutional systems, when you don't have checks and balances, when you don't have dispersion of power, it's all vulnerable. And then you can get to bad luck. And they got to their bad luck in the form of Xi Jinping. So in 2012, they got their strongman. Okay, so the very concepts of Deng Xiaoping, of dispersing power, of a two-term limit, of limiting the power of the great leader, all those things were destroyed by Xi Jinping. Like other populists, Xi Jinping ran an anti corruption campaign. Okay, so everybody should be skeptical whenever you hear an Anna Hazare say anti corruption. These are just excuses used to put the knife into your political foes and to whip up anti elite sentiment. Xi Jinping is precisely that, bit of a villager, not very literate, not well read, has not read books, has not traveled the world. He's that kind of strong man. And he used the anti corruption campaign to harm the elite and to consolidate power. And that is where China's decline began. So even in Chinese GDP data, you see a decline in Chinese GDP. I say even in because Chinese GDP data is even more untrustworthy than Indian GDP data. And you look in 20 other measures, China has done very badly. But then you have to see the full moving pieces that when the Chinese catastrophes of industrial policy started blowing up, they have a demand problem. Okay, so industrial policy has failed and failed and failed in China in field after field after field, such as real estate. Okay, so in
Yeah.
field after field, the Chinese state chooses a champion that now we're going to do electric vehicles, and they create ridiculous levels of oversupply as only a communist country can do. And
Yeah.
there is no local demand for those vehicles. There is no global demand for those vehicles. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles are piling up in warehouses and nobody wants to buy them. So this is a failure of industrial policy. It is a lack of market principles. Those companies don't generate ROE. Okay? The Chinese stock market is resiliently stuck because the Chinese industrial policy system is not a normal, healthy capitalism, and it does not work. It cannot work because it is not a market economy. There is only one answer, which is to build and run the checks and balances of firms, private ownership, stock market, as we do in India, as the whole world does. So I don't think that we are holding our breath waiting for China to fail. We are at the hardest stage for third parties because China is now big. It is at its biggest,
Yeah.
systemically important country, and their local economy is in disarray. So the pressure is on exports. That they are an overproduction system. By design, the Communist Party engineers one piece of overproduction after another based on state leadership. So the government decides that now we're going to overproduce X, and they get ridiculous overproduction of that. So the world is at this peak China moment where there's the largest China economy and the maximal demand to dump goods abroad, where the companies in China are based on various kinds of subsidies. Okay, so ranging from AI models to electric vehicles, it's the same story where there is a dumping going on, which is not financially sound in any remote sense, but it's state driven, it's industrial policy driven. So, what is to be done? As you said, should we wait for this period to subside, or should we allow it to flood into our country with benefits and costs? I think that in some sectors, so the key is there a meaningful Indian production capability? For example, in LLMs, there is no meaningful Indian production capability. We should worry about the strategic damage that Chinese LLMs can do to India. Okay, so I'm sure their processing is jaundiced in various ways. I think a DRDO head recently said that, how can I trust a Chinese model inside my drone? That's correct. You can't put those things into many applications. So it is entirely possible for a Chinese model to praise the killings in Tiananmen Square. And so we've got to be cautious about the use of Chinese models. But for the rest, other sectors in India where really India is absent, okay, then getting a flood of cheap things is not a bad thing. So that's a industrial policy judgment, and I'll come back to your state capability question in a moment. The good news is trade barriers against China are hardly unique to India. All countries are doing them. So effectively, China is being isolated from the world trading system. So I think we should think of a world which is doing reasonable free trade with each other, and we need to do more of that. So as I said, we need not a free trade agreement with the UK or the EU that is good by Indian standards. We need a free trade agreement with the UK and the EU, which is a normal trade agreement by their standards. They are vastly ahead of us in their concepts of globalization. So there's plenty to do. There's a very large world economy. See, India is a small country. Okay, there's a very large world economy to play in. As long as you wall off China in some sectors, then the Indian firms get the opportunity of playing the Indian market. But more important, get the opportunity of playing all these rich countries who are all facing the same battles, and they are throwing up barriers against China with greater state capability compared to us. Okay? So I don't think that you should accept the inevitability that China will keep on doing this forever. In fact, there is a dynamic at motion. The dynamic is that Xi Jinping put an end to the normal, successful evolution of China towards a better country in terms of more economic freedom, more political freedom. He reversed China's improvements in VDM and in the Freedom House Index. Okay, he reversed Chinese GDP growth. Even Chinese data shows slower GDP growth in China today. And if you go to other data sources, it's much worse. And the China model is not working. And you are not a hopeless, silly person waiting for them to change more in the future. And there's plenty to do. So it's not like we are losing something fundamental when we wall off China in some segments of the economy. And I did say there are some sectors, like should you have a flood of Chinese lithium ion batteries coming into India? By the way, I just want to say uh, my wonderful researcher friends and collaborators and co-authors, Nikit Abhyankar and Amol Fadke of UC Berkeley, and Gautam Bambawale, former Indian ambassador to China, and Ashwin Gambhir and Shantanu Dikshit of Prayas, and I are building a paper on this very subject right now.
Oh,
That
brilliant.
how to find that balance of benefiting from cheap Chinese lithium ion batteries, but recognizing the adverse consequences of a kill switch controlled in China and finding responses whereby we can do better in pursuing our own self interest. Okay, so I don't want to say it's black and white, it's tough, but we should try. Finally, I come to the state capability question. When Eli and I wrote that article, we sort of closed our eyes and thought to ourselves that when we were the macro finance group at the NIPFP and we were working closely with the Department of Economic Affairs, Ministry of Finance, we were de facto an advisory group working closely with the Ministry of Finance. Would we have been able to work with the MOF of that age, with the intellectual and bureaucratic culture of that age, where Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister and Rangarajan was the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and we had a variety of people in the bureaucracy where Monte Ahluwalia was deputy chairman, and so on. In that environment, could we have been part of a meaningful, useful Indian process of understanding these questions and 60% of the time coming out correct on that industrial policy sounding thing? I think the answer is yes. I think we would have. In that age, we could have, we would have, we wouldn't have been 100% right. We would have been 60% right. So I recognize that this is a very different India. State capability has declined greatly. So today you would not be able to do it. Today we should be very, very skeptical about anything sounding like industrial policy in India. Today's Indian state is not a useful player in the Indian economy, and consulting firms that work with the Indian government don't have the opportunity to solve the basic problems of the Indian state. But I think of this at a deeper level that, can we, should we recreate the political settlement, the intellectual climate, the thinking power in the Indian society? I think the answer is yes. So I think both statements are true. That in the short term, we can't, but can we go back to a better India in terms of the thinkers, in terms of the intellectual culture, in terms of the role for knowledge and intellectualism in the Indian state, in the quality of bureaucracy and the quality of external people working with teams inside government, in terms of having external people who are upstream of the policy process and not consultants helping the government write English to support the decisions of the government. Okay, can there be a movement in these directions? I think the answer is yes. And so I think all of us should put this picture together as short term, long term. What could you do today? What kind of capabilities should we be building for the future?
Yeah.
A short-termist view that we should be prioritizing the questions and activities that today's civil servants are asking for is a bit self-defeating, because the Indian state has had a remarkable decline of state capability, and the ability of internal people and systems and procedures to come up with good ideas is very limited. And so helping officials and politicians implement their policy agenda is not very useful.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, just a small follow up on this, and you can be very brief about it. But can we make a case, and I don't like the question myself, but can we make a case where does India really have an obligation to contribute to the global Western relatively free market view of China? Or can we play our own game in the sense that if their manufacturing bases are being affected by the Chinese overcapacity and dumping, and therefore they're putting up a lot of export controls, which in turn will in some way um, impact or contribute to China's implosion, should India also play that same game? Or can we be a little bit more self interested and dishonest about it all, saying, okay, you make the China, the implosion possible. But in the meantime, I will try and maximize my self interest. And if I can get cheap, let's say, again, not the electronic surveillance, etc., but if I can get cheap Chinese goods on a whole variety of other things, I'm just going to go open up on those things.
In some respects, we undoubtedly should. Remember, I said that there are places where there is no meaningful
Indian,
capability
yeah,
in the firms in India. We should just open the floodgates. We should take cheap Chinese goods. I have no hang-ups about that.
right.
It's only where there is a plausible, meaningful Indian industry or there are strategic threats that we need protectionism against China. So I don't have a problem with a wide variety of cheap things coming from China. In terms of collaboration with the West, so one level is to say, of course, only Indian interests matter. Of course, only Indian interests matter. I will not move even one micron away from the statement. We are here to maximize for India.
Yeah.
Okay. But you can be naive and transactional about it, or you can be more strategic about it. That's the
Exactly.
trade-off. That, like, if we have any kind of understanding of Japan, then we will play for 50 years, and then we will become more strategic, and then there will be a lot of give and take, and we will respect Japanese concerns. We will collaborate with Japan on many of their priorities so that in exchange, they will respect our concerns and they will collaborate with us on many of our priorities on the next 50 years. We will modify many elements of domestic policy in ways that suit Japanese interests, as they will modify many elements of their policies in ways that suit our interests. And everything I have just said is a negation of one intellectual failure of Indian foreign policy, which is called strategic autonomy.
Yeah. Okay. I'm very conscious of the time, Ajay. So I'm going to be populist myself and I'm going to end with two really broad questions and we'll take that one by one. You can be as brief or as elaborate as you wish. And these are, probably questions that, you might not like because it's not very specific. It's not very this thing, but it is broad questions. In terms of global risk, because that is what this episode is on. We know that there is global risk in terms of we spoke about political polarization, breakdown of trade, and many of the episodes have spoken about that. We've spoken about increasing use of sanctions and even money, etc. In other episodes, we spoke about China. One thing we've not spoken about explicitly, and we don't necessarily need to go into that, is climate change. But is there anything else I'm missing in terms of it might not be 50 years down the line, but in the next 10 years, what are the kind of risks that we should look out for at a global level? Um, is AI? I mean, we know there is a sovereign AI that part, but will the way that you mentioned about social media changing the social fabric of the world, can AI do something like that? I don't want to get into the cheap part, the easy part about will AI steal our jobs, etc. But is there a almost an epistemological threat that AI can give? Can that change the world order? And is there something else I'm missing out on?
I'm 60 years old. I'm a white-haired Unix hippie. So I'm cautious about my opinions on these matters. I'm very nervous about the harm that AI is doing to the growth of young people. So, done right, AI is a phenomenal partner to our knowledge building and our education. Okay, I hope you are using AI every day. I use AI 25 times every day. Okay, it's a
Absolutely.
very powerful partner to my learning process. I love it and
Yeah.
I'm thrilled for it. But I'm very worried about young people that when you don't sweat and do the hard work yourself, then you don't get the knowledge. And there are too many institutional settings where there are things like homeworks and exams which are being spoiled by AI. And then too many people are taking the shortcuts and then not getting the knowledge. So, in an ideal world, a child was brought up dreaming of ideas, dreaming of knowledge, with an intrinsic motivation to acquire knowledge. Those kind of children will triumph because AI will support their thirst for knowledge. But the children who were brought up transactional to win exams, to win homeworks, I worry about them. So the people who do work in the office trying to get ahead and get a promotion will use the AI and get the damn promotion, but then in the process they'll not get the knowledge. So I'm this is just me, a 60-year-old white-haired Unix hippie ranting. I'm sure the world will work out a bit better than what I'm thinking, but this is my concern that I have always watched and waited with pleasure and hope at the next generation. I'm proud of the younger people coming up in India. Okay. I love that next generation of intellectuals coming up in India, the thinkers coming up in India. All my life, I'm invested in the people behind me. You know many elements of what I have done. I just love it that I think of myself as a product of my age. I was born in 1966. It was a very shitty India, and things have gotten better. So the children of liberalization should just be so great. They should be so much better. It is just my one fear, my one concern that will people cut corners on doing maths problems when the AI can do your problem for you?
Yeah, and I somehow think that we are in that kind of golden generation where we've built the hard knowledge ourselves, and now we can use AI to really amplify all our. It could be outputs, it could be our learnings, and so on. But yeah, there's an epistemological thing. Yeah, any other big risk I'm leaving out? Global risk.
That's all. Yeah. So you could think geopolitics and strategy. I think everybody understands the list of phenomena and scenarios we are thinking about. We're thinking about a Russian escalation into Western Europe. We're thinking of a collapse of the Putin regime. We're thinking of loose nukes. We're thinking of a next 1989 where Russia breaks into 20 countries, of Chinese land grab into Russia, of Vladivostok going back to China. We're thinking about a North Korean attack against South Korea and Japan. We're thinking of the implosion in China. uh, I worry a lot about Israel. Israel is a great country, is a wonderful partner to India, is a very important part of the Middle East. A key part of stability in the Middle East has been the fact that Israel is and has been the dominant military power of the Middle East. Uh, but will Israel be able to maintain its position and its greatness? And to what extent is Netanyahu a right wing nationalist who is damaging the idea of Israel? Okay, so this is just conventional thinking all around the world.
Yeah.
And each of these fault lines can blow up and turn into a mess.
Yeah. Final question, I promise, which is on India. I want to close on the India note. Yeah, sure. Crisis will not automatically produce reform. I think we've kind of understood that. Let's take the standard, the Kingdom schema. You have got the problem, you've got the policy, you've got politics. There have been multiple situations in which you've had a problem, you've had even some kind of political things. But is it your argument that the policies have not been built during peacetime, and therefore we are not able to produce the reform, or we are not able to kind of bring in the good ideas? Ajay, I don't know, I've been thinking about this quite a bit. There are so many problems to which I think the solutions exist. It's not new. I mean, in one set, for example, the politics failed us. When we think about agriculture reforms, the politics failed us, right? We had a solution. I think those were farm laws. I mean, we can debate plus or minus 2 percentage points. You could do more, but by and large, they were liberalizing reforms. But on other bits, reform has been so painfully slow, and we don't need to rethink on how to get it done. As in, it could be labor, it could be, we still don't have land reforms, the structural issues, some parts of finance. You've worked so much on some of the ideas. The bankruptcy law that came in has now, I think, receded in terms of its effectiveness. I'm saying that, there are certain things for sure that we need to build newer policy solutions during peacetime. But there are other things where the solution clearly exists, perhaps, or I don't know if I'm overstating it. But yet, even when the crisis was presented, we didn't move on that. During COVID, that could have been a wonderful opportunity to get through some of the labor laws reforms. Yes, we just codified it, we redrafted it, we now have it in four codes, but I don't think it's dramatically changed the way we do business in India in terms of labor, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to belabor that, but I think yeah, you get my bit.
So let me put it up in a couple of points. First, as I already said, that progress seldom comes from the leadership of today's politicians and today's civil servants. Okay? So you just got to write it down that if you went to Ministry of Commerce people and spoke about trade policy in the late 80s and early 90s, they would have probably said things like single window. Okay, so single window is the imagination of a bureaucrat.
Yeah.
That's all. And nothing interesting gets done in single window. Okay? The point is to tear down the interference by the Indian state into the society. That will never be hatched by the present serving civil servants and politicians. Those knowledge bases and that consensus needs to be created outside in the society. And when we go back to think about all the areas of progress where India moved, it came out of that sort of long-term journey where many people in India moved positions, and the nature of the popularity and support gradient faced by a prime minister or finance minister changed. When a finance minister would get criticized for doing inflation targeting, you will not get inflation targeting. Then the world changed. Finance ministers started getting praised for doing inflation targeting. Then we got inflation targeting. Okay, watch. RBI governor, RBI deputy governor did not do inflation targeting. So if you go meet an RBI governor and say, sir, can I help you on some reforms? They're not going to come up with anything meaningful. So the important progress is hatched outside. That's my first idea. My second idea is that if you had to do a one slogan, a bumper sticker, I think, Anupam, we should make a Takshashila t-shirt out of this. Okay, if we had to make a slogan for what is wrong with India, it is too much central planning and too little rule of law.
Yeah.
That's it. At heart, there's way too much government control and there is not enough rule of law. There's just way too much executive discretion. There is just random arbitrary power placed in the hands of too many civil servants. Now, the full knowledge set of how to take this diagnosis and turn it into state capability is actually not widely known in India.
Yeah.
There's a very limited knowledge of documents, of people who know how to take this as an organizing principle and say, recreate the Competition Commission of India or recreate the TRAI. So imagine if I put up this problem to you that what is wrong with TRAI is too much central planning, too much industrial policy, and too little rule of law. Okay, what would you do different? I think that's not a ready knowledge set that we have today. What would be the nature of the laws? What would be the nature of the organization design? How would we create the checks and balances? How would we come up with a new age TRAI, which would actually be far more respectful, which would stubbornly refuse to do industrial policy, which would not make decisions where it picks winners, that this is a good technology, that is a bad technology, and where there would be rule of law procedures when the coercive power of the state impacts upon private people. So, or take taxes. Okay, that do we in India today have those high quality masterpiece documents of clean tax policy, the economic principles, the draft laws, and then the checks and balances, the rule of law for how tax administration would work? I think this is still ideas and arguments floating at a high level in the hands of a few people. It'll become mainstream and then it will go to the state. So you and I are at ground zero. It is we, the thinkers, it is we, the research organizations, that have to take these programs seriously. So there again, I want to go back and complain about 1991 to 2011. Okay, we economists played a critical role in 1991 to 2011. Great, I'm proud of all the contributions of the economists. But we economists did not have knowledge of implementation. And how do you build a government organization which will actually do free trade? Right. We didn't have that knowledge. So the economists totally messed up on all the areas that they touched. That they did some sloganeering and some high level, but they didn't actually contribute to writing good laws. So, for example, famously, Indira Gandhi's FERA, which criminalized cross-border activities, was amended in 1999 to make FEMA. Okay, and economists were very proud that, see, we are liberalizing, we are opening up to the world. Well, dude, go read the law carefully. FEMA is just the same as FERA. with the criminal aspects removed. You don't go to jail. For the rest, FEMA at the beginning was exactly the same as FERA. And in 2015, the criminal penalties are back.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this full knowledge set that do we want capital controls? If we want some capital controls, how would we do it without central planning? Okay. Currently, we do industrial policy. Reserve Bank says, in this way, I will allow capital, in this way, I will not. But how is a government to have intricate knowledge about finance? That's an unreasonable ask. It's as silly as a Ministry of Industry saying lithium-ion battery is bad, sodium-ion battery is good. How is an official to ever know that this kind of hedged government bond is okay, this kind of not hedged corporate bond is not okay? RBI says foreigners cannot buy this kind of bond, but they can buy that kind of bond. And I just have to shake my head and say, how do you know? Okay, it is the conceit of socialism where officials pretend that they know what is correct for the country. So when you take too much central planning, not much rule of law as the organizing principle of what is wrong in India, then I think we in the research organizations are the choke point. We don't have the knowledge, the documents, the planning, the preparation, the community building, the persuasion, the creation of human capital, the creation of hundreds of people through which these things will get solved.
Right. I think that lays out a very good, I suppose, charter for us to follow now, a mandate for us. So thanks for that. Thank you so much, Ajay, for joining me in this episode. And because you've been so generous with your time, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anupam. Always happy to do things. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you're interested in public policy, AI, geopolitics, or defense, do check out the courses offered by the Takshila Institution. And for more conversations like this one, stay tuned for the next episode of Turbulence, Global Finance and Geoeconomics in an Age of Disruption, a special series of the All Things Policy podcast supported by Zerodha.